Hi, everybody. We had some technical difficulties at church today, me being the technical difficulty. So I wanted to give you a condensed version of what the message was today. Last week, I was doing some Bible surfing and I ran across the book of Habakkuk. And by the second verse, I was just drawn in because I was so mesmerized by how what happened in his day is so similar to what we see happening now. And it just made me realize that the Bible teaches us in Hebrews 4, that the word of God is living, that it's active, that it's applicable today. And it just made me realize that something that was written 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, how true it is yet even today, but that's because the word of God is living. It's not dead. So Habakkuk. If you haven't read the book, you should. I would encourage you to, but it's just 3 short chapters. And just to give you a little background information as to what was happening around his time frame, the people of Israel, they had actually split into 2 nations. The 10 tribes were in the northern nation and 2 tribes were in the southern nation. So you had 2 different nations. One was called Israel, one was called Judah. And in fact, the nation of Israel at this time had already been dispersed. The Assyrians had rose to be a world power and they conquered Israel and they exiled the people, and the people were no longer a nation. It didn't exist. They were just dispersed across the globe. And so Judah had the remaining 2 tribes, and they had various kings that reigned and ruled over them. And they had just come out of the reign of a good king. He was a godly king. So the country was prosperous. They were doing well morally, they were doing well spiritually, they were doing well economically. They were a very blessed people. But this good king, he died. And so a bad king, an ungodly king, came to leadership. And with his ungodliness came moral decay, economic decay, spiritual decay. Violence was everywhere. People were going without. They didn't have enough food to eat. Businesses were going bust. And this actually broke Habakkuk's heart. And in this short book, he's a different type of prophet, because most prophets, they got a word from God and they lived that out and they spoke that word to the people. But this prophet, he actually has some questions, and he's going to God with some questions, and we get to kind of eavesdrop into what his questions are. And so it starts out, chapter 1, verse 2. Right away he says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen?" And really, I don't have to go any further than that. Because if you think about it, we all have a "how long, oh Lord" moment, issue in our life where we feel overwhelmed and God, he's just not listening. And he's not listening, let alone doing anything about it. I mean, we all have times where we just want to just shake the heavens and say, God, do you not know that I'm here? Are you not aware of what I'm going through? Do you not see this trial? Do you not see this tribulation that I'm going through? I mean, how long must I put up with no job? How long must I put up with my children not living for you and going wayward? How long must I put up with this sickness? How long must I put up with this dream not coming to fruition? And God, quite frankly, how long do we have to put up with COVID-19? And why aren't you doing anything about it? We all have times where we want to believe in the goodness of God, but what we are seeing with our eyes doesn't justify what we believe in our hearts. Where is God? God, where are you in the middle of this mess? And so then verse 2 goes on to say, violence is everywhere. I cry to you, but you don't come to save. I mean, he's heartbroken over the things that he's seeing and living and experiencing. Must I forever, verse 3, see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? And I thought to myself, is he watching the same news channels that I'm watching? Because when I turn on the news to see what's going on, all I'm seeing is misery and violence everywhere. He goes on to say, wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. Doesn't it just seem that that's everywhere? I mean, you can't even, you read on the news or hear on the news all the time, someone walking into a store and someone else not agreeing with their choice to wear a mask or not wear a mask. And the next thing you know, everybody's just arguing and fighting all the time. Verse 4, the law has become paralyzed, which means ignored. People ignore the law and do what they want to do. And there's no justice in the courts. The wicked far outnumber the righteous, so that justice has come perverted. Doesn't this speak to the times that we are living in right now? And doesn't it speak not only to us globally and nationally, but personally? We all have moments in our walk with Jesus and our walk on this journey of faith where it appears that God is not bringing into action what you hope and expect. And we all feel at times that we don't understand what he's doing, and it just doesn't seem fair. In other words, you just want to ask God, God, what is going on? And where are you? Why are the heavens shut up to my prayer? What I appreciated about these first 5 verses, and I think it's the first point that God highlighted to me, was use times of questioning as opportunities to go deeper with God and not withdraw from him. Habakkuk wasn't afraid to get raw and real and down to the nitty-gritty of life with God. And just what if, the Bible tells us that deep calleth unto the deep. The deep things of God calls unto the deep things of you. And what if you start to acknowledge your weakness and your helplessness? What if talking to God about it is the first step into creating and developing and walking in his strength? So his strength can be your strength when you are weak. What if acknowledging your doubts is the first step in really building up your faith? But here's the temptation. When we go through these crisis moments of our faith, when we go through these hard times and God's not moving how we think he should be moving, and you can be sure that during these times, the devil is going to start playing with your mind and making you and telling you and making you feel like God doesn't love you, like God's never going to show up, like God, he's got more important things to do, that you're a loser, that's why nothing's happening, because God really doesn't care. But because we don't see him doing anything, we feel like he doesn't love me. The temptation is we can become disillusioned and think that because God isn't showing up, then I'm going to distance myself from you. And don't we see that? We all know people who have retreated or pulled back in their relationship with God, in their walk with God, in their church attendance, in their church, in gathering and fellowshipping with other people. And many times at the root of that is disappointment and pain. But they have been in these crisis moments of their faith where what they see doesn't justify what they know to be true in their hearts. And it's hard to reconcile that. But God is inviting us to use those times as times where we press in and get deeper with him, and we rely on the character of God rather than relying on what we see. And God invites us to cry out to him in the midst of our crisis, our fears, our sorrows, and our worries. Habakkuk took his complaints to God, and he worked through them with prayer, waiting on God for answers, and accepting the answers he didn't like. And we're going to see that in a minute. We're going to move on to verse 5. The Lord replied, "Look around at the nations, and look and be amazed. For I am doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't believe, even if someone told you about it." Now, if I'm Habakkuk right here, I'm thinking, wow, God's really going to turn this around, and we are going to be so blessed. I mean, this nation has been going down the tanker now, but God's going to turn this around, and everything's going to be wonderful. That's what I would be thinking. That's what I would be expecting. That's what I would be wanting. But look at what God says. And I'm going to read verses 6 through 11, so hang with me. "I'm raising up the Babylonians, a cruel and violent people. They will march across the world and conquer other lands. They are notorious for their cruelty and do whatever they like. Their horses are swifter than cheetahs and fiercer than wolves at dusk. The charioteers charge from far away. Like eagles, they swoop down to devour their prey. On they come, all bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind, sweeping captives ahead of them like sand. They scoff at kings and princes and scorn all their fortresses. They simply pile ramps of earth against their walls and capture them. They sweep past like the wind and are gone, but they are deeply guilty, for their own strength is their God." So God says, I'm going to do something. I'm working. Even though you don't think I'm working, even though you don't see I'm working, I'm going to do something. But the key is, it's not at all what he wants or what he expects. Because what he says is, wait a second, God. Surely this really isn't what you're going to do. That's what he says in the next verse. Surely you're not going to bring the Babylonians to wipe us out. Surely this is not what you're going to do. Surely, God, this cannot be the plan that you have. So the second point that I want to bring up is surrendering to God may involve, and usually does involve, a different plan and answer than what you thought. That's why it's called surrendering. Many times God moves in ways that we fail to recognize him moving because he's not moving in the way that we plan or expect or even told him to move. That's me. I go to God with my laundry list of things, and then I tell him the solutions. I need this, and this is how you do this. I need this, and this is how you do that. I've got it all planned out. I can tell you how many times I've been disappointed because it never turns out that way. Rarely. But God is about surrender. God wants your heart. Even Jesus had to surrender. In the garden, remember he said, "Lord, if there be any other way." In other words, Lord, if there's plan B, let's go with plan B. That's what Habakkuk is saying here. Lord, if there's plan B, let's go with plan B. Because you certainly can't mean that this is what you really think you want to be doing. It can't be this way. So, the Bible tells us in Proverbs, it's great. It says, man plans his ways, but God directs his steps. I'm not saying it's wrong to plan, but surrender should always supersede plan. God, I've got a plan, but if that's not the plan you want for me, I'm going to surrender my plan. We quote that verse in Jeremiah, "I know the plans that I have for you," but somehow we rationalize it that our plans are God's plans. Well, maybe it is if you've surrendered. But usually what we mean is, okay, the plan that I have for my life, I'm going to convince God that that's what he needs to do for me. Instead of saying, God, this is how I want it to go, but I am so willing to give that up because but your ways are higher than my ways, your thoughts are higher than my thoughts, and you know what's best. So even though I don't see that you're working, here Habakkuk didn't see that he was working, but the whole time God was at work, planning world affairs. It wasn't just about Habakkuk, but he was shaping the matters of the whole world for his purpose and his glory. So God was infinitely active. He's not disconnected from your mess at all. He's active in it. So then the third thing, so in chapter 2, God starts talking about how he's going to bring judgment. He will eventually bring judgment. He tells Habakkuk to write it down, though the vision tarry. It's not going to happen right away. God's timing is not our timing. It may not happen right away, but you can be sure of this. This is going to happen. And then it talks about all the judgment that God is going to bring. It may seem like we are outnumbered. It may seem like the devil is winning, but he's not. We know the end. And we need to walk in faith that the end is already here. What do I mean by that? We do this all the time if you think about it. Every time you go to a baby shower before a woman actually has had the baby, that's faith. Because you are walking in a moment believing that the end is already here. You're celebrating a baby believing that that's going to happen. There's no guarantee that that's going to happen. I've known of cases where it hasn't happened. Tragically so. But we do that in faith. We have wedding showers. We buy a stock expecting that it to skyrise and gain in money and monetary value. So we need to live like we know what the end is, because we do know what the end is. The victory is already won, and the victory is ours. So the third thing I want to get to is finally at the end in chapter 3. Habakkuk in verse 16 says, I'm trembling inside when I heard all of these things. My lips quivered with fear, my legs gave way beneath me, and I shook in terror. I will wait quietly for the coming day when disaster will strike the people who invade us. Even though the fig trees have no blossoms and there are no grapes on the vine, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, he's describing a famine that is coming. But then the very next verse he says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me as sure-footed as a deer, able to tread upon heights. The moral of the story is the righteous live by faith. Habakkuk took this journey from pain and disappointment and frustration to a place of rest and confidence and even joy, because he chose to trust God. He chose to press in to the character of God, to what he knew to be true, and found joy in the promise that God had given him, even though his outside circumstances looked very bleak. Now, as I was getting ready for this message, the word fear just kept cropping up to me. That during this unknown time, people have been motivated in walking in fear and maybe have not even realized it. But it's unknown. There's many variables like we've never seen before. And the same was true in Habakkuk's day. But he took a moment to pause and realize that even though it doesn't seem like God is working, he is actively involved in what is going on. And the miracle of the gospel is that he can take that which was meant for evil and turn it for good. Not just our good, but for his glory and his purposes. The victory is his and the victory is ours. And in that, we can rejoice today. So, Father, I just ask that everybody that watches this just get their faith built up. In fear, you can just go back to hell, because the victory is ours. That's been promised to us.